We're going to be looking back at the book of Luke. And I don't usually title my messages. Did we lose someone?
He's working on it, shoelaces.
Oh. How old is he?
He's going to be 13. He's probably going to be 13.
12, going to be 13. Savannah, how old? 12. Mason? 12. My sermon today is about a 12-year-old. Talk about relevance.
Yes.
All right. One of the mysteries of the Gospels is what happened that first 29 or 30 years of Jesus' life after the Nativity. And the only glimpse that we have is when Jesus was 12 years old. So, one question we have about our scriptural account of the life of Jesus, as we seek to find out who he is why that big gap? And that gap has been filled because nobody likes a vacuum of information, right? We've learned in media relations that you've got to tell the public something, otherwise they will fill in the gaps. The news reporters and the Twitterverse and Facebooks will feed information whether it's right or not. So there's a lot of inaccurate guesses about what happened prior to Jesus' public ministry. There is, in fact, and I'd never heard of this, I'd heard of the so-called, there are other gospels out there that are not considered part of the canon, not considered reliable, credible. They have a little bit of historical value. There's the gospel of, I think there's one of Judas, there's one of Thomas, there's one of Mary, something like that. But there's also the infant gospel of Thomas. Any of you ever heard that? And don't read that. It's just full of silliness. In that book, I'm told, I hadn't read it, never heard about it until I started studying this, that Jesus actually was kind of upset as a child and killed at least 2 people using his power. So what is it that God in his providence in this Holy Spirit-inspired word, what is it that God wanted us to know about Jesus as a 12-year-old? And is that a model for how we should treat our children? Is it a model for how we should be? Do we need to kind of regress and start over? And I want you to think a little bit about your childhood, and I want us to think about the humanity of Jesus' childhood. I have a couple of distinct memories of my youth. As one is at 10 years old. We didn't have earbuds and stuff in our ears all the time, and things to do while we were walking. I used to have to walk up to the bus stop. It was only like 10 or 15 miles, I think. No, actually, it was about a half mile on a gravel road. So I did a lot of thinking. Right? I didn't have my mind occupied with all this other stuff. I'm not fussing about that as an old person, but I enjoyed my alone time. Just like any family, we had some issues. My older brother had run away from home, and he spent a couple of days in a cave down on Beaver Creek. He kind of didn't mind living out in the wild, and he did okay until he decided to do some hitchhiking, and the first person that gave him a ride was a Missouri State Trooper. And so the trooper brought him home, and of course our family was upset and in a little bit of a crisis. Mom had some health issues, and when the officer brought my brother to the door, Mom just collapsed. We called an ambulance, and it was somewhere between what we would call a nervous breakdown and perhaps a blood sugar issue. She was a diabetic. But anyway, she, I don't know how many of you have had the policeman come to the door.
Yeah.
It's often not a pleasant situation. I was usually the policeman, but on this side we were on the other side of that. And so there was, it was traumatic. So not too long after that, I think, I was walking up to the bus stop, and I began to think about whether I could have handled that if Dad hadn't been there and that had happened. Could I have handled it? Could I have driven somebody to the hospital? Because would I have known how to call for help? There was no 911 back then. And we lived 5 miles out of town, no neighbors that I could have called on. And you know what, as I walked along at 10 years old, I said, yeah, I think I could. So, I didn't have a bar mitzvah, we didn't have a coming out party, we didn't have a jubilee, we didn't have any of those things, and we still don't have those. You've heard me complain about that in American society. We don't have a good transition from childhood to adulthood. Is it, when you turn 18, when you're registered for the draft, when you turn 16, get your driver's license, it's the first time you're with a person of the opposite sex. We have all these vice-related transitions that define us as a man or woman. And that was a moment for me. The other moment that I remember, again, walking down that same road, but this was several years later, I was 13 years old. And I was in myself, as 13-year-olds often are, and I was thinking about, do I walk funny and do I talk funny and all these kinds of things. And I finally decided, I had a moment of insight where I said, I think about myself way too much. And so I decided I'm not going to do that. Now, it's not bad to be introspective, but if you're ruminating about yourself all the time, that's not good. And there's a maturation process. I probably would have come out. I snapped out of it that day. And I haven't thought about myself since. No, that's not true. But I do have to be intentionally reflective. But I remember those two transitions. What does the apostle say in 1 Corinthians 13? When I was a child, I acted, spoke, thought like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. So I'm not going to go on my tirade about the immaturity of American young people. One of the things I enjoy reading is biographies, and I picked up a biography of J. Edgar Hoover, and that's not all that relevant to this, except that during his youth and early college age years, there was this push toward masculinity. So this issue of toxic masculinity or gender identity or being a manly man, but being in touch with yourself and having the softer, all those kinds of questions, those are not new questions. In fact, perhaps one of the reasons for the origin of the Boy Scouts is so that we could have this outdoor vigorous exercise thing. And you remember Teddy Roosevelt. This was in that general era where he was a weak child and he fought his way out of it. Worked his way and ran his way and was an outdoors person and a soldier and all kinds of manly man kinds of things. And so we've always had questions about when a child becomes a man. Let's go to the scripture and hear this little biographical tidbit. I'm looking at Matthew 2, Luke 2, verse 39. When they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. So that was about when Jesus was, say, 2 years old. They'd done the bris and all of that, the dedication. The boy grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was on him. This is very similar to the admonition in the book of Proverbs, in chapter 3 of Proverbs, verses 3 through 7. And we're going to see this theme again at the end of the message. Every year, his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival. After those days were over, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. How many of you have been left behind by your parents accidentally? Anybody? Anybody raised at a gas station? Okay, it happens. It happens. And so you can kind of get a sense of maybe the tensions that were going on here. They did not find him. They returned to Jerusalem to search for him. For some reason, I see Mary and Joseph in a station wagon turning around. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Now, in all likelihood, what happened is that the women folk would go ahead of the men folk so that they could get the camp set up and have the meal ready by the time the men got there. That is the natural order of things. Just in the Bible. And so they were probably separated. And so Mary's with this group and Joseph's with this group. And Joseph thinks, well, Jesus is with Mary. Mary thinks, well, Jesus is with Joseph. And I don't know whether Jesus had his bar mitzvah yet or any kind of celebration. But it was very common that around this age, there would be this transition where a young boy would officially step into his father's profession, of course, carpenter to carpenter, and assume not a complete adult identity, but would assume primarily a responsibility for their own sin and conduct. So we often talk about this as the age of accountability. I suspect that the age of accountability varies from person to person, and that means when can we say you are responsible for your own behavior? It's not your parents' fault, right? Despite what your counselor says, it's not all your parents' fault, right? Now, some, no doubt, but there's an accountability there. And a transition into becoming more a part of the leader of the family. Of course, Jesus was the firstborn and would have had some leadership responsibility thrust on him. And we don't know much about Joseph after this, so Jesus probably had maybe a premature responsibility. I don't know what Jesus had seen by this time. Had he seen some funerals? Had he seen some stoning of prostitutes? Had he seen some slaves dragged off? Had he seen Roman soldiers beat Jewish people? Had he seen the secret rebellions? Had he seen families broken apart? We don't know. We tend to think about this idyllic carpenter shop with, Mary and Joseph and Jesus all have halos as they're working. But I've referred to this ad campaign that I'm not really a big fan of, but it's like He Gets Us. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
So they have Jesus, they have people in different situations, and then they say, well, Jesus did that too. Jesus gets us. I think that's a little backwards theology-wise, but if it gets people's attention, then that's fine. But Jesus does get us. And I think we probably forget maybe some of the things that we experienced, that we had to process when we were 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. The conflict we may have seen in our family, or extended family, some challenges, some times of, and those of you that are parents will think about the times that you have shielded your kids from some things, so that maybe they grow up not realizing how hard marriage is or how hard finances are. We were not poor, but we did not live in abundance. One of my other childhood memories is my dad chasing the banker off the property. He came out to repossess it. And we managed to come out of that. So there's all kinds of things that kids might be exposed to. But here's the thing. See, this was not an unusual saying. Why were you searching for me? He asked them. Don't you know that it was necessary for me to be at my Father's house, about my Father's business? I'm 12. I'm moving into training to prepare for what my Father has done, and I'm an apprentice to that skill. And sorry, Daddy Joseph, my Father's house is where I need to be.
Yeah.
So we're pretty confident that he was a carpenter, because that would have been the way of things, and they may have had to travel. I remember, Jerry, I was talking to you about some of the places you've lived, and you said, when you're a tradesperson, you go to where the work is, right? That was true in a little teeny town of Nazareth, population maybe 200, everybody related. So there were some construction projects going on in other places, and they may have had to travel. We just need to give a little bit more humanity, I think, to who Jesus was as a child and how his family might have been as well. And we have to remember that the focus of this sermon series, who is Jesus, is so that we do not create our own idol Jesus and replace the real Jesus with our wannabe Jesus. They talked about in this biography of Hoover in the early 1900s, around World War I, a little bit before and after. They talked about this preacher who was a very influential Presbyterian pastor, and that's where J. Edgar was going to church, and I think teaching Sunday school. And he talked about maintaining the purity of the white race, and he talked about how we need to get rid of this feminine ideal of Jesus, and so he wanted pictures of Jesus kind of buffed up and looking manly and masculine. And so he was, at least as portrayed in this account, he was creating the Jesus that he wanted America's manhood to emulate. And Jesus is obviously more complex than that. One of the other things that I remember as a kid, I used to walk from school down to the public library and then down to the grocery store where my dad met his carpool, and I would ride home with him several times a week. And it was about 3/4 of a mile. I did measure that the other day. And I had, from a young age, I had an interest in psychology. So I was over in the psychology, after I read the jokes in Boys Life magazine, I would go to the psychology section. And I saw this book called Your Child from 8 to 9. And there was another series from 9 to 10, another from 11 to... So I read those and kind of measured my progress against what the textbook said I should be doing. And I was astounded to discover I was very normal in my development. Let's take a look at some things that are happening to kids at the age of these young people. There's an improvement in reasoning. This part of the brain starts to develop. They don't rely entirely on others to make decisions or to explain or to understand. There's an improvement in information processing. There's a capacity for long-range planning. The real peril of youth is not understanding consequences of tying a towel around your neck and jumping off the well house thinking you can fly. Another childhood memory just came to me. Did not work. Able to consider other points of view and increasing in empathy, increasing control over impulsive behavior, strong language and communication skills, thinking beyond the literal from concrete to abstract. Another little bit, I'm just walking you down memory lane. But when I was in kindergarten or first grade, somebody asked about what pasteurized milk was or why we boil water or something like that. And the teacher said, well, there's these little mean men in stuff, and you have to boil it to kill them. And I still have this image of these little Luigis floating around and dying in boiling water. Because kids think concretely, right? That becomes less so as they get older. Awareness of issues of justice and equity. Now, every kid will say that's not fair from a very early age, but the realization of that comes more true. There are, of course, physical and hormonal changes that will vary from individual to individual. There is a stage of self-focus, which I described as in my own experience. Physical skills improve. Growth spurts can occur. Relationships outside the family can occur or will occur. So the importance of friends over family is more important. The pulling away from being with the parents all the time and wanting to have other kinds of relationships, that's often painful for parents. A sense of personal identity, who am I? Leadership and citizenship can develop. I ran for vice president of my 5th grade student council class. My campaign manager developed the slogan, "Don't be a mole, vote for Joel." That's the reason I won that election, and probably the reason why I have not won anything since. There are emotional shifts and rebellion, and parents are challenged to understand that this is a developmental stage of a kid learning some independence and separating from their family a little bit at a time. Personal sense of morality and questioning values happens. Desire for acceptance increases, and family and routine are important. 2 things that have really been damaged in recent years in American culture. So here is the capstone verse of chapter 2 in the book of Luke. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. Now, were there ever times of tension in the family? I think, not following your parents home from a trip out of town was probably a time of tension. His mother kept all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people, or with man. Let's take a look at those words there. The word that is used for increased, does anybody have a translation with a different word for Jesus increased? Grew. A little bit of Greek study that's available to all of you. Increased is more than just incremental development. It refers to a forging, a promoting, an advancement, even a hammering out. And so this was more than just a natural process. It was a process of pressures and influences. We were talking with our son last night about some of the hard times that he went through, and the students that he deals with now. He's a university professor. He said, we fail to build true resilience in people when we keep them from all suffering. We don't know what our limits are. We don't know what our capacities are. We don't know what our strengths are. It's an interesting study about during World War II, during the bombing of London. It was just constant, and one of the observations about the people of London was stay calm and carry on, right? Some of you have that shirt. It just, they didn't stop their life. They didn't live underground. Sometimes they didn't even necessarily run to the bomb shelters when the sirens went off. It just got to be. And so what happened is they found out that they survived time after time after time, and so their fear did not rule their life because they had already shown that they could survive. And we perhaps do like that in some ways. We have an enlightened and welcomed acceptance and promotion of mental health and providing services. But within that, we need to be careful that we teach people that sometimes of depression is normal and you can survive it, and sometimes of anxiety is normal and you can survive it, and sometimes of self-doubt is normal and you can survive it. Now, I'm not critical of anybody who has crippling anxiety and crippling depression, but we have perhaps, and I say this as someone who does some level of counseling, I'm not just going to go into a situation and say we need to buck up. We can help people learn some skills, but we don't know how strong we are until those things are tested. And this is the kind of increase that's implied in this original word here, being hammered out over time. This is something that we become very aware of at around this age, 12-ish, but it's something that's a continuing process as we age and develop. And wisdom. Jesus increased in wisdom. This was a wonderful word. Greek is Sophia, and you hear that in words like sophomore. And sophomore is a combination of the Greek word for wisdom and the Greek word for foolishness. So if you're sophomoric, sophistry, philosophy, love of wisdom. It is broad and full of intelligence, varied knowledge, acquired by experience, discovery of meaning, skill in managing affairs, prudence in relationships, practicing upright living, and moving out of a stage of fear and a stage of self-determination based on core values. Children search for meaning and can become reflective, and this personal connection with faith can happen around this age. This is a very important developmental stage. Wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. The word favor is basically the word grace. It comes from the Greek root charis, as in charisma. It is a giftedness of grace, that which offers joy, goodwill, governed by divine grace, beneficial to others. Jesus grew in the way that we need to continue to grow, increasing in our growth in every area that's hammered out, forged, advanced over time, in wisdom, broad and full intelligence, and in favor, being a gift of grace to others as a reflection of the gift of God's grace to us. We say that Jesus didn't really begin his teaching until he was 30-ish, but I think he teaches us from the age of 12 about how to grow in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and man.